Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University in Shanghai. Today, the 四海为学 collaborative learning project is very happy to host Professor Carine Defoort and her talk, The Many Faces of Confucianism, How to Learn from China. We also want to thank Professors Friederike, I didn't ask you how to say her last name.
Assandri, Friederike Assandri.
Assandri, okay. For chairing this session, and Professors Cheng and Xiaojiao, Xiaojiao for providing comments. I'd also like to remind everyone that we have another talk scheduled in May, and there are a couple of upcoming seminars that everyone is welcome to join. The 四海为学 project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the conventional practices of contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we're not interested in male peacocks, in jerks, or other forms of egoism and self-promoting. We also hope to curb other forms of aggressive and look at me, I'm smarter than you type of attitudes that we sometimes see in academic exchanges. 四海为学 hopes to accomplish this slight change in academic orientation by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions and responses, and generally collaborative learning together. As many of us know all too well, miscommunication and missed communication can have disastrous results, from ordering the wrong food to starting wars. With the goal of fostering real, humble, honest exchanges and open communication, the 四海为学 project encourages unselfish, anti-egoist, don't be a jerk, and let's actually try to learn together, try to learn from one another types of attitudes. So here we also have a little bit less of an emphasis on learning about Chinese philosophy and focus a little bit more on learning from Chinese philosophy. I think Professor Carine Defoort's talk and much of her work in general, at least in my mind, makes this kind of contribution to the field. Today's chair is Professor, I'm going to mess this up again, Friederike Assandri.
Yeah, that was good.
Okay, with a bit of an American accent, who earned her PhD in sinology from the University of Heidelberg and has held various teaching and research positions in China and Europe. She's currently working at Leipzig University. So without further ado, thank you very much for chairing this session.
Okay, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to introduce and chair this session. First of all, apologies to the audience for the wrong name in the Zoom picture. That is a glitch. I can't fix it right now. My name is Friederike Assandri, not Beatrice Assandri. And I'm actually very excited to introduce this talk of Carine Defoort. Carine Defoort is full professor in Chinese studies at the University of Leuven in Belgium. She studied sinology and philosophy at the same university in Leuven, at National Taiwan University, and at the University of Hawaii. Her fields of interest are primarily Chinese thought of the Warring States period, and secondarily, the modern interpretation, mostly Republican, of that thought. So she has worked on Heguanzi, Shizi, Mozi, Zhuangzi, Yangzhu, and such topics as the legitimacy of Chinese philosophy, regicide, abdication, and correct naming. She was the editor of the Contemporary Chinese Thought, Routledge and Taylor Francis, until 2020. And she still is the corresponding editor for Europe of the China Review International. She has an amazing publication list. I mean, it is so long and so impressive. A lot of the articles deal, as you already said, also with the reception of Chinese philosophy and the question, what can we learn from Chinese philosophy here, and with the legitimacy of Chinese philosophy, which is very fascinating. And I'm looking very much forward to the talk. So the stage is yours, Carine.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to share. Yes, so first of all, many thanks to Paul for having me giving a lecture, and also very many thanks to Friederike to chair the session, and Xiaojiao and Cheng to give comments, and of course to all of you to be here. My talk is basically how to learn from China, and I want to reflect on a topic that I've been thinking through for decades, and I basically use Confucianism as a sort of a case study. So the subtitle is really the major title. Some of the things that I will be saying here, you may have heard in earlier versions or in short versions, but today I try to, think through it. My talk consists of 3 parts. First, I want to introduce different ways of arguing, and I use one example of a term. Then I go to the case study, Confucianism, and then is the reflection on what I think I have learned from China in the last decades and also its ramifications. So let me start with an example. The case of loyalty, or the term loyal. Imagine that you are in lockdown and you really want to drink whiskey, and you ask 2 of your best friends, a boy and a girl, to go to a shop and buy some whiskey for you, and you give them some money, and they go. But before they reach the shop, they agree with each other that you have an alcohol problem and they perhaps should not buy this whiskey for you. And so they return, they give you the money, and they say, yeah, we did not buy the whiskey. And so you're angry and you say, I really thought you were my loyal friends, and now I discover that you are not being loyal. And then the 2 friends, they defend their decision, their common decision. I mean, they agree on the decision, so there's no difference there, but they defend it in a different way. And so the boy will say, loyalty is fine, but it's not the finest. I mean, there is a hierarchy of values, and other things may be higher than loyalty, such as, for example, health. Or maybe the boy will even say that, in some cases, loyalty is just wrong. One has to dismiss loyalty if, it's for a friend who is an alcoholic and wants whiskey. So the boy is really making a hierarchy and determining how important loyalty is, whether it's something good or bad or something in between. Now, the girl has another way of arguing, and she will say, yes, of course. I mean, just like you, my good friend, I cherish loyalty. No question about that. But what I call loyalty, what I call loyal, is not buying whiskey for an alcoholic friend. So she does not challenge the value, but she discusses, or she comes up with a new content. So now what my suggestion is that, of course, both types of arguing and all sorts of combinations and nuances, about which we can talk in the 3rd part, exist in all cultures. But my argument would be that what the boy does is more visibly, is more clearly what we tend to do and what we notice easily. And when I say we, I think I basically mean Europeans, because I don't really want to make any claim about how it is in America. And I think what the girl does is more visibly what Chinese people do and have been doing. And so that's what I think I've learned from China, that if we only stick to the first and we only notice basically the first debate, we miss out a lot. But of course, as I just said, I think both types of arguing exist in all cultures, and therefore I want to start by giving examples of where China was against loyalty, and then another case where China was in favor of loyalty. Whenever I talk about this against and in favor, so the first type of arguing, you will see this boy in the corner of my PowerPoint. So I must say it was not easy because they are in a minority, but here I found a cartoon by Liao Pingxiong. He made it just at the beginning of the Open Up and Reform era. And he describes a little boy in 1907 who was 7 years old. He had to memorize books, and whenever he made a mistake, he was hit by his Confucian teacher, and he had to memorize the Sishu, the 4 books. And he says 60 years later, it was still basically the same, but then with the communists. And you see that behind the communist who was hitting him, in this case, he had to memorize the sayings of Mao Zedong, you see half of the character Zhong. So what this cartoon at least suggests is that he does not like Zhong. He thinks, whether it's Confucian or communist, it's the same, it's like not a very nice value. And he would probably put some other values higher in the hierarchy, such as freedom or independence and so on. So this is an example of, people criticizing the value of Zhong. I must say it's rather exceptional in the sense that well, it does not dominate, I would say, in China. Of course, examples of a positive evaluation of Zhong are everywhere. You see them on posters, you see them in the streets, you see them in advertisements. So there is a lot of positive feelings towards Zhong. So, but this is not what I want to discuss. What I want to discuss is the girls' way of arguing. And so there you come then, if you share an evaluation of Zhong, and in this case, it's of its positive sense, then you can make a next step and start discussing what you mean by Zhong. And I have a few examples from, well, these examples from the early age, and then I have an example of a contemporary time. So here you have 3 quotes, but I could have found many more of masters defining what they consider Zhong. So in the case of Xunzi, he has 4 definitions, all related to how one treats a ruler. And one of the definitions is benefiting the ruler while negating his orders. Call it loyal, or I call it loyal. So this is pretty much like the girl who did not want to buy the whiskey for her friend, because this is what she calls being loyal. Another quote is from the Mozi: if superiors commit mistakes, await the moment to correct them. If you have a good idea, discuss it with them only. So don't publicly criticize them, and don't take credit for your good ideas. Let them take credit for it. This is what I call a loyal minister. That's in the Mozi. And another example is in the text, Lu Mukung Wen Zi. One who constantly mentions his ruler's mistakes can be called a loyal minister. So what you see, they all assume that loyalty is something good. And it's on the basis of that assumption that they are then inspired to redefine what they consider, at least in this context. It's not a definition maybe that fits every context, but what they consider loyal in this context. You see that there is a variety of opinions. The variety of opinions does not go along the school or lineage lines. For example, Xunzi and Zi would both be considered Confucian, but they say something different. And what you also see is that, they can challenge the ruler. It's not because they favor loyalty that they all, like a herd of sheep, do whatever the ruler asks them to do. No, on the contrary. I mean, especially Zi is very challenging. So my last example, before we go to the Confucian case, it's something more recent. You can find this on Wikipedia. It's describing Zhou Enlai. When he had cancer, initially Mao Zedong did not allow him to go to the hospital. Of course, Mao Zedong at that time was already not very clear-headed anymore, and he was pretty much controlled by his wife and the other members of the the Gang of Four. But then when finally in 75 he could go to the hospital, when he was taken into the surgery room, he shouted, and apparently Deng Xiaoping was there also, he shouted, 我是中于党中于人民的，我不是投降派. So he does not say, you know, in the case of a ruler who is no longer in control, one does not have to be loyal, or loyalty is not necessarily a good thing. No, he assumes that Zhong is just, you know, something that everyone appreciates, but he does specify what he means by Zhong. And in this case, the specification is by clarifying whom he was Zhong to, in this case, Zhong Yutang and Zhong Yu Renmin. He doesn't say anything else about being or not being Zhong to other people. So I think a part of the specification of a term is who does it and to whom one does it. That's also in the early texts. And so this is also the case here. So my conclusion of this example, this introductory example, would be that we find in the early texts, but I also think today, very few, I'm not saying they're non-existent, but very few arguments against loyalty or in favor of its suspension in case of bad rulers. So the value of loyalty is widely shared. But, and now I move from the first argument, you know, pro-loyalty, to the girls type of arguing under the shared facade, you know, of appreciation for loyalty. There is a variety of suggestions on the content of loyalty. And so if we go now and look at Confucianism, I again admit that there is a wide variety of views on Confucianism that do fit the first type of arguing. That's why I have again the boy in the corner there. And both contra and pro. I begin with the contra. Again, they are, I think, a minority and very often influenced by the West. I think that the strongest cases of anti-Confucian feelings were the Taiping Rebellion, the May 4th movement, and also the Cultural Revolution, and more specifically, the anti-Confucius and Limpiao campaign in the 70s. And of course, if you look wider also to the West, you would have people, let's say to Europe. I'm thinking of journalists in Europe, in Belgium, or even also academics. They would blame Confucianism for, you know, patriarchy in the Chinese tradition, hypocrisy, you know, people smiling at you but thinking something else, social pressure, you know, the pressure of the family, gender inequality, and so on and so on. So there is lots of people who would be in general, not lots of people, maybe in Europe, yes, I think so, especially nowadays. But in general, in China, I think the strongest criticism of Confucianism was often influenced by Western thought, but of course you also have pre-Western criticism of Confucianism. I'm thinking of some stories in the Zhuangzi. I'm thinking of the Feiru chapter of the Mozi. I'm thinking of a chapter in the Leuven, criticism of Confucius. So there is contra-Confucianism in and outside of China. There is also a lot of pro-Confucianism, and now I'm thinking of people who claim that Confucianism is the Zhugan of Chinese culture, and then I'm thinking of all the Confucius institutes that represent Confucianism all over the world, people claiming that it's China's most representative and important philosophy, people claiming that Confucianism contains some alternative to the West in social, political, and economic ways, the Asian values, and so on and so on. I mean, everyone knows these arguments. But what is different again from the contra view is that this pro view can lead to the next step. Namely, if there is a sort of a shared evaluation, one can, I'm not saying that one necessarily does it, but one can then specify what one means by Confucianism. So we could say that people who stick to the pro-contra I mean, largely, they would probably have a rather implicit default view of Confucianism without very much, specifying or discussing this. They would think of Confucius as the person we know from the Luen, an itinerant teacher who has lots of moral ideas, teaching his disciples, not much political impact, a great passion for rituals, for family relationships, and so on, and so on. Everybody knows this. So here, the step can be made, and therefore we have the girl in the corner of the PowerPoint. People who share an appreciation for Confucianism, either explicit or implicit, they might insist on using other sources than the Luen to present Confucianism, or other values, or other quotes, other narratives about Confucius, or the same quotes and the same values, but other interpretations of them. Or they might highlight other characteristics of Confucius, and so on. So here I want to just present 6 of that sort of portrayals. Some of them are related to each other historically, others are more different. I only selected 6, but I think one can select many more. So what they share is that they appreciate Confucianism, and yet they will promote all sorts of different things, and some of the things are rather challenging to the government, but not in such an aggressive or arrogant way as the contra views are. So they also appreciate Confucianism, but they come up with some other type of Confucianism. So the first one is the idea of the crowned king. Here the reference will not so much be to the Luen, but to the Chunqiu, which portrays Confucius as a political visionary. One of the important people, of course, who presented it was Kang Youwei, who, gave life again to the Su Wang idea of the Gongyang tradition, but one of his own nicknames was Chang Su, somebody, who was beyond, above, or continuing the Su Wang. So he had quite an opinion of himself. Another person in this line would be Jiang Qing, who was rather famous a while ago, because he also relies on the Gongyang tradition, on the Chunqiu. He thinks of Confucius as somebody who is politically inspiring, and his views would not only disagree with Western democracy, but also disagree with the policy of the current Chinese government in the name of Confucianism. So this is my first example. Second example is, of course, related to it, that I would call here Confucius sort of a proto-communist. And the source that here would be used is rather the Li Yun chapter of the Li Ji, in which Confucius talks about an ideal of Datong, an ideal of equality, no family, no institutions, no hierarchy, a long, long, long time ago, followed by Xiaokang, in which there were institutions, in which there was hierarchy, there were families, not so good, but still okay, which is moderate welfare or something. Again, Kang Youwei is one of the people who focused on that source, turned the chronology around and said that actually what Confucius projected in the faraway past was something that he meant to project, or he saw as a faraway future, an aim, an ideal. And then you have Mao Zedong, who wrote in one of his letters, like, Kang Youwei was right, but he was not able to realize it, and I'm going to realize this. And actually, in the 50s, he had some policies that were pretty much in line with Datong Shu. So he realized Datong, and then, well, to some extent. And then you get the end of the Cultural Revolution and the Open Up and Reform era. Deng Xiaoping saying, well, maybe we went a bit too far, let's slow down. And first we need Xiaokang. The Xiaokang remained a core portion of Chinese policies until a few years ago. It was also part of Xi Jinping's dream. Now it has been realized. officially. So again, what you see here is that both Datong and Xiaokang are from Confucius, or can be related to Confucius in a Confucian source. And although they can stand for a wide variety of policies, they can be presented under the label of Confucianism. Even if I focus on Xiaokang only, which is more the sort of Confucianism that we are familiar with, if you go from the the beginning of the Open Up and Reform till Xi Jinping, you will see that there is a whole variety of ways of how people would define Xiaokang. So again, not only under Confucianism, but also under terms such as Zhong, Datong, Xiaokang, and many others, the variety lies in the different interpretation, assuming that you share an appreciation for the term. My third example is religious, and again, it's connected with the Kang Youwei. This is a picture of a statue of Confucius in London in the Confucius Institute, and on the back of the statue you have this poem, or maybe a prayer, because it sounds very Christian. So it's the ode to Confucius: glory to his name, noble was his birth. In great proud China, Confucius was born. O my sage, O my lord, and so on and so on. So this is yet another vision of Confucius that is being sent out and financed in Hong Kong, because there Confucianism is still, I think, a religion, while it is not an official religion in the PRC, but it is tolerated. And so you get all sorts of expressions of Confucian religion which are not being punished. So here again, you see that there is a sort of a gray zone under the name of Confucianism, not necessarily total obedience, but also not total protest. The fourth one is, we could refer to the odes, because there is a dialogue in the Leuven in which Confucius says to his disciples, but why don't you learn to recite the odes? It will help you to express complaint, to express different feelings, to get inspired, to get comfort, and so on. So it's really important to understand the odes. And here I rely basically on the work of Joël Toraval and Biou, because they describe a whole popular trend of Confucianism, which they explicitly distinguish from, what happens in philosophy departments, where they study abstract Confucian philosophies. And they say that there is a very strong trend among the population to memorize texts. And there is indeed, excuse me, there's somebody who wants to come in here in my room. Not going to answer the door and see what they say. So one of the texts that children had to memorize before they were 12 was the Sanzi. There are many others. In the Sanzi, for example, they would learn about values, they would learn about texts, about east, west, north, south, numbers, colors, animals, everything a child had to know. And so the idea was, and still is, I think, in this, reviving type of Confucianism, that children basically have to memorize texts. One of the people who promotes this very much is Wang Caikui. The idea is they just have to memorize the text. They don't have to understand them. They don't have to agree with them. They memorize them. And once they are adults or they get older, once their memory is no longer very good, they have all their texts, like a sort of a background in their, like the whole Chinese heritage is in their mind. And then when they meet, something happens, they need to express a feeling, they want to complain, they want to do it in a polite way, they want to be inspired, whatever. They just are such full personalities and so well educated and so well shaped, because they have this whole background of texts that then they can like interpret and interpret and interpret ever again and again and again. So what they do then is pretty much what I describe here as what this girl does. You know, the same text are an endless source of inspiration. I don't think it necessarily always happens that if people memorize all these texts, they become that sort of very cultivated, fruitful, artistic, very inspired personality, but it can happen. And so this is the idea of Confucius as a popular sage. You find online many examples, and here is one. This is the time the Cheng. So it goes on and on and on. Oh, yeah. Actually, I have my students also memorize a portion of the Daxue, the first part, the Qing. And in the beginning, they always complain. They think it's so old-fashioned and so terrible. But then when after graduating, sometimes they tell me, oh, I recited the Daxue on a Chinese train and everyone was so impressed. So some of them at least are happy about it. And I myself, even though my memory is no longer very good, but I also memorized some texts, of course, also ancient Greek texts, because we had to do that, and some poems. And I must say, you know, what Wang Caigui is talking about, I do recognize this and I do agree with this, that it does not necessarily have this result, but these texts, yeah, they are like a very rich resource of all sorts of things you want to give shape or express or think about. So this is the fifth type of Confucianism. And then the sixth type is, sorry, that was the fourth one. The fifth one is the idea of a lost dog, Xiaojiao. So this is either a dog who lost his home, or it's a dog of a family in mourning. This is a book that was written by Leuven on the basis of his lecture notes at Beijing. And because he was so much criticized, he wrote another book the following year, so the first in 2007 and then in 2008, to defend his view. And here you could say that the sources are at least 5 Han books that tell the story about Confucius being compared to such a Xiaojiao, and Confucius himself laughing and saying, oh, how very true is this comparison. So as Leuven says, I really believe that this was not meant as an insult to Confucius. What he rather tried to do was portray Confucius in a way that was not controlled by the government. Because when he was young, you know, he was sent to the countryside together with the rest of his generation. Confucius was, you know, depicted as the very bad guy. Nowadays, Confucius is depicted or used by the government, he would say, as the very good guy. He is against both of them. And he wants to bring Confucius to life again as the guy who went around from one state to another. He had all these wonderful ideas, but, you know, nobody listened to him, which is very frustrating. And then how do you handle this? How do you live with this? How do you handle the fact that, you know, you think you have something to say, but, you know, people don't hear you. So this model is also a model of Confucianism that might be very healing for people who, unlike Leuven and unlike Xi Jinping, never recovered from the time that they had to go to the countryside and they missed out on education and they did not have a career. And maybe also for young people today who feel that they are so sung, that they are lost, too much pressure, a life that is too much about money, too superficial, whatever. So one of the things is that there is some sort of a sung culture online. The recent buzzword more and more young Chinese are using to describe themselves, says somebody. So that's another portrayal. This again is clearly not what the government wants, but it is in name of Confucianism. It is with respect for Confucianism, and it's not being punished. I mean, Li Ling is not in jail or anything. And the last one that I want to present here, it's the ideal of a critical advisor. And here the source would be the Xiaojiao, and more particularly section 15, in which Zhengzi asks Confucius, somebody who's always obedient towards his father, would that person be Xiao? And Confucius says, absolutely not. To be Xiao, one has to give frank advice and sometimes criticize one's father. And the same with the minister towards his ruler. That's really quintessential, a part of Xiao. So this is also, I think, an ideal that even though some people may not necessarily explicitly identify with Confucianism, but many revolutionaries or whistleblowers do have this, I would say, Confucian ideal that guides them in speaking up, even though it might be dangerous. And I'm thinking, of course, of more recently, Leuven, who spoke up about the coronavirus. He was criticized by the government, and he died, and he left behind a pregnant wife and a little toddler. And after that, you had all these people wearing the mask, you know, saying, supporting him, and in the fact that he spoke up and that they should also speak up. So I think this is also some characteristic of Confucianism, which is also not always appreciated by the government. So this brings me to my reflection. So on the one hand, and we are again here with the boy, the arguments about the value of Confucianism, I think very often people who basically focus on, you know, whether they like it or not, or whether it was good for China or not, whether it's good for the world or not, I think they have a tendency to use a rather vague notion of Confucianism. So they don't really go very much into the content. And I think this has various reasons. One reason is, again, I'm talking about Europe, superficial media. If you know how the media work and how they, you know, they don't have much time, they don't have much money, they all copy each other. That's one of the reasons I think that what something is said about Confucianism or China, it's rather superficial, it's pretty cliche. Another reason I think, which is maybe related to it, is that the last 2 centuries, there has been a sort of a Western, you know, originally European cultural dominance, which has made, I think, European intellectuals a bit lazy, or let's say very lazy, in the sense that they don't really think, they think they are like, you know, the exemplars of the world and no need to learn from somebody else. So this has also caused, I think, Westerners to talk about China and other parts of the world in a rather cliche way. But a third reason, I think, is that this type of arguing, you know, the pro and contra, maybe naturally leads to a failure to go into the details of the content. So maybe that's the nature of that type of arguing to some extent. And of course, people have tried to remedy this. And now I want to say some things about the types of remedy. I mean, the better scholars, I think, would say, you know, I like Confucianism, I think it's good. And I specify that I mean this Confucianism, let's say, for example, the Confucianism of Confucius himself and not Han and Song and Ming and later. You can do this, and it's a good idea. It brings the 2 types of arguing together, you know, evaluating and discussing the content. But you also lose then on both sides. Your evaluation has shrunk, the scope has shrunk. You know, no longer making a statement about Confucianism, but about one specific small type of Confucianism, mainly supposedly the original Confucianism. And you also lose on the other side that you will still be challenged. It's still, in the eyes of some people, too vague. I mean, you say the Confucianism of Confucius, but you know, what is the Confucianism of Confucius? Which book do you rely upon? Let's say you rely upon the Leuven, which not everyone would agree with, but anyway, what does the Leuven say? How do you understand it? How do you interpret it? So you can try to find a position between the two, which I think is good, but you will also lose ground on both sides. Another way to remedy this or to explain this is that people will say, oh yeah, you know, Confucianism is a vague notion, but you know, that's because the Chinese language is vague. You know, and Xiao is a vague notion and Zhong is a vague notion, and it's all very vague. I don't really agree with this. I think these things are vague because they don't accord with our notions. Of course, if you look at Confucianism, you know, with the expectations of what Catholicism, then of course it does not have what we have because it differs from us. But I don't think there's anything particularly or regrettably vague about the Chinese concepts. And then I want to move to the third idea, and I say, of course, there is vagueness in the Chinese terms, but just as much as there is vagueness in our own familiar terms. I mean, philosophy is a vague term, religion is a vague term. It is all very vague, and you know, this is a notion I tried to explain when I discussed the legitimacy of Chinese philosophy. You know, philosophy is a bit like a family name to us. I mean, it's familiar. It doesn't mean that we totally see through it and that we have the right to, you know, define it and then determine who is in and who is out. So yes, if the Chinese notions are vague, then our notions are equally vague. Thus far, you know, the remedy suggests that we have a problem there. But I think this is only a problem in the first type of arguing. You know, we want to be in favor of against something, and we want to quickly and easily and finally determine what this thing is. Ideally, in a footnote or in the introduction. Let's get some definitions, and ideally the definitions stick to some essence or whatever, and then we can start arguing. But I think if we leave this type of arguing and we look at the second type of arguing, vagueness is not a problem. On the contrary, it's an opportunity. There is no vagueness in the term paperclip, and there is no vagueness in the term telephone, because, I mean, we couldn't care less. But as soon as you have a term that is important, that motivates people, that moves people, that influences people, whether positively, such as Confucianism in most cases, or negatively, such as terrorism in most cases, then the vagueness arises because it's contested. And this leads us then to the second type of argumentation. If you have a based appreciation of some notion, there is indeed a great variety of contents that will be suggested. In the case of Confucianism, I came up with 6, but there are many more others. And it will be by looking at other sources, at other values, at other quotes, other anecdotes, and so on. And this really leaves space for individual and challenging views. It's not as if the only way to express your opinion is by saying that you are against or in favor of something. You can very respectfully respect what others respect and come up with challenging views, as did Zisi when he was talking to Lu Mokung about Zhongchen. And this is not totally governed by the government. It's not because you respect Confucianism or you respect some Chinese values that you're totally just being obedient to whatever the Chinese say. I think this approach is also less Western. It's less considered Western by the Chinese. The Chinese government will easily say, oh yeah, they're all against Confucianism. They're just prejudiced and they they don't respect us. This type of approach, you have to know something about the Chinese text. You have to, be familiar with them, go into detail, show respect for them. So there is something less Western about this. And then finally, you see that the facade of shared evaluations hides a variety of interpretations. And this reminds me of a sentence that Leuven often quotes in his trilogy on the modern fate of Confucianism. It's in French. It's of a French 19th century scholar, intellectual, whom I did not know, but I checked it online. Plus c'est la même chose, plus ça change. So the more it's the same, the more it changes. So the more you insist that you're just being loyal, or the more you insist that, this is Confucianism, the more your audience should be alert that you're coming up with something new. The more it's the same, the more it changes. So my final conclusion, and this is like broadening up the topic a little bit further, it's that neither of these two approaches, nor the boys nor the girls, in its prototypical form, nor in any combination or variation, is essentially Western or Chinese. As I showed, both are present in China and discussing about China. But I do think they differ relatively in tendency, in sensitivity, and in training. I think the Chinese throughout history have been much more trained in the second type of argumentation. Just think of the examination system. Here is an old quote from the classics. Come up with a policy proposal on the basis of that quote. First, do some exegesis and do some analysis of the quote, and then come up with an idea. I think this is, these sources were endless sources of all sorts of new proposals. So that's my first point. The second is that the many contents of important notions are a sign of intellectual resilience in China. So it's not because Confucianism has many meanings that there is a problem with it, or that it is vague, as opposed to the Western concepts that would not be vague. No, I think it shows that under the same label, people come up with a wide variety of suggestions. I think the example of Zhong, Xunzi, these are very challenging and novel and daring definitions of Zhong. So it's only what looks like, a problematic type of vagueness in the first type of arguing is rather a source of inspiration and a result of challenge in the second type of arguing. Important terms have always been subjected to discursive appropriations, especially between dynasties and regimes. So I think it's not an exclusively Chinese characteristic that, in China, what do you call regicide? It depends whether you belong under the founding fathers or you belong to the previous dynasty, of course. And the same with democracy. It depends whether you belong to the new regime that has overthrown the previous regime. The words have a new meaning, and they are getting appropriated. This is universal everywhere in practice. Both approaches, the boy and the girl, I think they are, to some extent at least, limited. If you focus on the one, you get some blind spot on the content. If you focus on the content, you have some blind spot on how much you can, differ in appreciation. But they are both, I think, valuable and complementary. The evaluation will allow some vagueness in the content. The specification of the content will thrive on a shared evaluation, and that can be positive and negative, but not neutral. And then the fuzziness of important notions is not a regrettable failure to respond to some sort of supposed reality. It's a fruitful ground for imagination and communication. Here I give the example of human rights. I think if China, and I think that's the case since the 90s of the previous century, if they agree that human rights is valuable, that's the basis to start debating on what they think is the content of human rights. And of course you can disagree with it, obviously, but you should not be angry that they have another vision of human rights. I heard people being utterly shocked that exactly human rights, which is so dear to us, they start redefining in their way. No, I think if they would not do that and say, you know, we don't want human rights, we're not interested, as they did before the 90s, then there is no bridge to communicate. If they say, you know, we appreciate human rights, but this is, you know, the content we give to it, then, you know, there is a ground to talk about, to communicate. And so my last point would be that maybe we should also once in a while, you know, communicate on Chinese notions or other non-Western notions. Why should it always be human rights and democracy and you know, our notions? Why should we not sometimes, you know, all together discuss, you know, what we mean by Confucianism, what we mean by Tatung, by Xiaojiao, by Tianxia. It's not because we discuss these notions and so we have some basic appreciation of these notions that we have to agree on any specific claim of the Chinese government or any other Chinese. I mean, you can still very much disagree with each other, but you do have to have a basic respect. So I think sometimes discussing other notions than Western notions, or initially Western notions, it expresses an awareness of one's own positionality, that you realize that, you know, you come from a specific place with its specific concepts. And it also expresses a willingness to take others into account, in this case then China. So I think this is my story, and I'm looking forward to seeing you all, so I will stop sharing.
So let me unmute myself. Thank you very much for this really, excuse me, for this really inspiring talk with a lot of wonderful ideas. Now I will introduce, oh, is there an order for the commentators, or shall I go ladies first?
Yeah, okay, it's okay, whatever. So, yeah.
Okay, let's do it somewhat old-fashioned way. I'm happy to introduce Xiaojiao. Also happy to see you here. It has been a long time. She works as an assistant professor at the School of Philosophy at Beijing at Beijing Normal University. She is interested in Taoism and in the manuscript culture of early China, and focuses primarily in her research on the political philosophy of the Laozi and the Huanglao school. She received her bachelor from Sun Yat-sen University and her PhD from Beida. And while she was conducting her PhD research, she also spent a year in Dartmouth College and some time in Cornell as a visiting scholar. Her current research utilizes the newly excavated texts to explore the ideological connections between early Taoism, legalism, and the school of the military. And she's also interested in early Confucianism and in Neo-Taoism. Of the Weijin in Xuanxue, of the Weijin period. So, floor is yours, Xiaojiao.
Thank you, Friederike. Thank you so much. It's so good to see you. And many thanks to Paul and 四海为学 for the awesome organization. And I just really enjoyed Carine's lecture and felt that it's very enlightening to me in so many ways. So I actually have translated an article for Carine like several years ago. And that paper includes the first part of today's lecture, talking about the variant definitions of loyalty in ancient Chinese philosophy. And I'm so glad to see how she has developed the idea in that paper into even much broader and interesting topic. It's just so interesting. And I think just as Carine said, because there are so many different ways to make an argumentation or to define a notion, there also should be different perspectives when we look at Chinese philosophy or Chinese culture or even any other kind of culture. Instead of taking only mere one perspective. And only in that way, I think, can we understand each other better and can we learn from each other? I think which is also the aim of 四海为学, right? And I have one slight question to Carine. So in the Leuven chapter of the Analects, Confucius told his disciple Zheng Shen, he said, 无道一以贯之, right? Like my doctrine is that of all pervading unity. So I think similarly, there is also something consistent or essential in philosophical notions or even in Chinese philosophy. Although, of course, we can take different perspectives when we talk about the notions. For example, loyalty. I mean, of course, we can have like so many different ways to talk about loyalty, but it's basically it's something that comes from deep within us, although the external manifestations are so different. So I want to ask Carine, how should we understand the relationship between consistency or unity and different perspectives? Like, are there any sort of tension between them? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Xiaojiao. Nice to see you, and I hope I will see you in the coming months here.
Of course.
I think there's one quote from the Leuven that, you know, my way has like Yiquan that goes through it. It has been quoted extremely often, and very often in a way, you know, to say that there's like one consistent philosophy in the Leuven just because of that one statement. I don't think that is necessarily the case. I'm not saying it's necessarily not the case either. And you even make a stronger claim saying that there was like one consistency while in the whole of Chinese philosophy. I mean, that's even going further than what Confucius there says in that statement. I would say that, you know, if there is, I mean, to stay with my own talk, if there is a unity, it would be a shared appreciation for some values, which is then the basis for redefinitions. So the more shared value evaluation, the wider variety of redefinitions. So then maybe I'm saying the opposite of what you are saying, in the sense that I really think that if you, any notion you name in the Chinese tradition, let's say not only Zhong, but also Xiao, and you look at all the definitions that different people have come up with, it's an extreme variety of, you know, respect your parents to get rid of your parents and respect your ruler instead of your parents. Even that argument is made in the name of Xiao. So yeah, that's what I would say. There is, content-wise, there is an enormous richness, much more than the richness that you get with persuasive definitions in the West, like the person who came up with persuasive definitions in the 30s of the previous sentence, C.L. Stevenson. He said, you know, when he went through the Western tradition, he said, yeah, we have a lot of persuasive definitions. You know, what I described there, what the girl does is a persuasive definition. But if you want to do this and you don't want people to notice, you have to make sure that you're not too challenging, not too much diverting from, you know, the common content. Otherwise, people will not accept it. I think in the Chinese case, you can really go very far. From the look at Zisi, you know, Zhong, it's, you know, criticizing your ruler. That is Zhong. So I think there was a wide variety of possibilities there. But if you don't notice them and you only think, oh, they all appreciate Zhong, or they're also very loyal, or they're also very obedient, no, you're missing the point.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'm back. Thank you very much to both of you. Now I'll introduce the second commentator, Zhu Zhang. He is a professor of philosophy at East China Normal University, researcher at the Institute of Modern Chinese Thought and Culture. And he has a lot of, I'm not going to list them all, is a long list of very prestigious recognitions and and all kinds of things. A lot of publications too. I'm very amazing. I'm always amazed when I see people writing so much for books, and more than 90 articles, and is holding a lot of positions as director of Chinese Society for the History of Philosophy, of the Confucius Society, and various others. So welcome, and please make
Thank
your
you.
comment.
谢谢 Professor Carine 教授的这个讲座。您的这个报告啊，从我们日常生活的经验和中国历史上的政治文化现象啊，进入讨论儒家的多重面向。我听了以后啊，很受启发。特别是你把我们这个当前呢，在儒家文化的这个接受上所出现的一些现象，特别20世纪以来的一些现象啊，做了归类比如说这个比较有意思的肃王啊，对于大同的接受孔教啊，还有儒学的这个大众化呀，还有特别提到这个丧家狗，甚至对我们这个少数青年人的一些这个生活态度的变化呀，也敏感的捕捉到了关注到我们这个所谓的丧文化，还关注到我们这个一些对于这个社会批评的一些现象。总体来说，对我们当前儒家应该严格来讲是儒家文化在20世纪以来的一些表现呢，有非常这个敏感的这个关注。这是而且你也把它归纳成为几种现象，我觉得我听了以后很受启发。那么在您的这个报告里面还提到了对于我们这个文化的这个交流文化的这个多样性的理解特别欣赏的就是说多一些选择就会多一些变化这样的一个隐语对我们接受不同的文化背景有着不同的文化背景的人来接受不同的文化，会促进他自己乃至他周围和整个社会的一些变化，这也是被历史不断的验证。所以您说这个从中国的这个儒家文化中去了解去关注甚至你用了一个词叫学习我觉得这些这个学术态度我们都特别的这个欣赏。我呢有2个问题想和Carine 教授做一个交流。第一个问题刚才崔老师已经提到了，就是关于您在刚开始的时候引用的这个关于忠和和，特别是忠您把它理解成为特别引用了荀子还有子思还有墨子，就是对君主最高权力者的这种批评这个当然是忠的一个非常重要的表现。当然我们在过去的历史上还有您提到的就是所谓的这个忠诚于某种权利，当然这是然后传统的这个先秦的理解可能是对这个掌权者的某种批评，这当然是其中之一因为儒家讲从道不从君，也是您所引用的这个荀子里面所提到这样一句话。因此这就和儒家的这个忠的这个观念密切的联系在一起。我们知道在刚才小娇提到的这个吾道一以贯之这个忠恕而异义。那么忠是什么？朱熹解释到这个尽己之为忠就是把自己忠于自己内心的信念作为忠。因此一旦你要忠于自己的信念，也就是儒家所谓的这个道，忠于这个道的话，如果道和君的这个意志发生了分离的话，那么你就要做一个选择，这样的一个选择，你是选择忠于道还是忠于君， 可能就出现了您所提到的这个对于君主的批评，才是一种本源意义上的忠。那么实际上啊，除了由此引发，就忠这个概念在中国，当然更多的是被应用在政治领域中。那可能还有一个重要的领域，就是个人的伦理品质领域，就是我刚才提到的这个忠啊，还会用于在是否将自己内在的信念把它表现出来啊。就像中国宋明理学家们啊，比如说王阳明，他会理解忠是什么，就是把你内在的这个良知落实在您的生活之中，这就是一种忠，就是叫诚呐。诚就是你得把自己内在的道德意念变成一种道德行为。所以说，我想请教Carine 教授的一个问题就是，仅仅从政治角度来理解这个忠，是不是有一些可以讨论的空间？是不是可以应该从个人伦理，就是你是否忠诚于你的信念这个角度来进行考虑？这是第一个问题。第二个问题，也就是您今天的这样的一个主题，就是儒家的多重面相。这个我觉得您更多的是从一种社会文化现象，比如说非常有趣的小朋友在背《三字经》啊，同声同气，很可爱啊。再比如提到很多其实在我们这一边，在我们的这个文化领域中，它并不是属于一个主流的，比如说您提到的蒋庆啊，蒋庆，再比如说您提到的这个对于丧家狗的这本书的介绍啊，李林先生的这本书。那李林先生这本书的主旨啊，他可能是更倾向于把孔子作为一个 normal people， 就是我们一般的这样的一个人来，一个正常的人来理解，而不是放到那个架在那个很高的位置上来理解的一个跟我们一样，跟你我他一样的一个人的理解。所以他引用的啊，就是说你这个《论语》里面的话。可是有些人认为这是对孔子的不敬，就像我们过去把孔子称为孔老二也不太礼貌的一种说法。我觉得这里中间可能有误解，而且这个丧家狗、丧家犬呢，和这个青年文化中的这个丧文化啊，可能并没有一个必然的联系啊。这个丧字就是您说的中国的哲学的很多概念，您说到叫做很多是模糊性的啊。这个模糊性不仅仅是因为语言带来的，而是因为这个概念本身就有很大的张力，在历史的长河中啊，我们有不断的增加，有不断的这个改变对它的这样的一个解释，于是很多的概念，很多的这个名词就会出现了很丰富的，甚至有的时候是矛盾冲突的这样的一种现象。我想在西方文化中有很多的概念也会有这样的一个现象，这恰恰是人类语言的魅力之所在。如果我们接受了一个一成不变的一个观念，那我们不需要做任何工作了，我们就等着就行了。所以您的这个像类似于这个中国文化中的很多的这些现象呢，或者包括这些归纳，我前面说的啊，既有很多的启发，也有很多的这个问题。这个问题就是说，仅仅从社会文化现象，甚至这个现象里面充满了冲突，充满了还有一些并不能够代表我们目前主流的，或者说更大多数人接受的这种东西。您比如说蒋庆这种观念在我们的学界接受并不是特别的广。我也是做政治哲学研究的，那么他的一套政治儒学的一种观念并不为很多人接受。因此当然这是一个就是说您所讲的这个儒家的这个多重面向我认为，我不知道理解对不对，我认为主要是从社会现象、文化现象角度的，而儒家的真正的多重面向，我觉得还有以下几个层次可以供我们讨论。第一，它是一个世界观啊。您刚才讲，无论是政治上讲天下也罢，讲我们的理想生活状态大同小康也罢啊，还有您提到的在这个我们儒学所表现的，像这个伪善呐 还有男权至上啊，还有性别这些话题里面呢，我想啊，这可能都是一些现象，它不是一个本质。本质是什么？我们怎么去看待这个世界？那么儒家有一整套我们看待这个世界的这个理论，用孔子的话就是信于天道啊。但是这个信于天道内容是什么，外延是什么，可能会有很多的讨论。我觉得这是第一个，它是一种世界观。第二个，儒家它可能就是您所说的一种价值观念啊，即使这种价值观念存在一定的模糊性，但是为了让这个更多的人呐接受这套观念，他就会把它做了一种确定性的一种定义，比如说您所熟悉的啊仁义礼智信啊忠和，他会用一种比较规定的这个明确的内容告诉他啊这个是什么啊，便于大家在价值上没有模糊性，在哲学探讨可以模糊性，在价值上有模糊性，可能会带来生活中的巨大的麻烦，就很多的 trouble 就会因为你对于这个价值理解的不一样，会带来很大的问题。我觉得这是儒学的第二个面向。第三个面向，它是一种政治制度，它会运用在这个制度设计上，因为它对人与人之间关系的这个理解，对于什么是好的社会的理解，什么是好的生活的理解，什么是好的人与人之间关系的这样一个理解，什么是好的分配方式，什么是好的这个权力的这样的一个运行的模式，它也有一整套的啊。当然在这个君主专制的时候，他可能会把这种解释有利于君主，可是儒家的这些士大夫们也努力的想用另外一种解释，就是所谓道和君之间的这样的一种张力，这种矛盾。所以我首先我觉得它第三个层次，它应该是一种政治制度。第四个啊，它还是以儒者，我们提到儒家儒学，你浮现的是一个一个具体的人，比如说是孔子，比如说是孟子，比如说是荀子，比如说朱熹，比如说董仲舒，比如说王阳明，比如说您刚才提到的康长素啊，甚至是当代的所谓的儒者王财贵啊，这个蒋庆呢，他是一个具有人格形象的、具有人格内容的一个一个的人。因此，当我们提到某种这样价值观念的时候，我们会想到某一个人。司马迁讲：“读其书，想见其人。”啊，看到孔子的书，想看到孔子是个什么样子啊，于是跑到孔子生活的地方去感受孔子的气息。我们看到孟子啊，这副浩然之气，这个大丈夫的形象。所以历代的儒者用他们自己的人生也谱写了一套儒家的这个文化。所以我们觉得这个第四个面向可能是一种人格，儒家用以自己的生命历程所构造，当然也有建构。你也可以想象，比如说孔子到底是个什么样子，是素王还是这个我们历代所打扮成的那个样子？就您刚才在那个 PPT 上投影了很多那个大坏蛋的形象，还是一个这个至高无上的啊全能先知的一个形象，它有建构在里面。啊，我们也有一套这个有一个活生生的人，在历史上有一个活生生的人，而现在的人也即将走入历史，由后人去建构。我觉得这是第四个面向。第五个面向啊，就是可能和您今天提到的这个有点这个内容有点相关系的，就是我们会把它作为一种生活的方式啊。就是您看到的啊，当一个很小的小孩在背《三字经》，或者刚才你那个非常有趣的那个 picture， 就是67岁的时候在背书被打，60岁还在背书，还在被批评，对吧？大家都是历史了啊，也就是我们都在不断的错误中学习进步的。因此我们会看到啊，就是儒家的一种生活方式。啊，这种生活方式体现在很多。您是个著名的汉学家，也有很多中国的朋友。那么这个时候，这个我们这种交往的方式，我们这种或者是叫含蓄的表达方式也罢，还是说 这个我们在生活中所表现出来的种种的迹象也罢，我们为了简单化的处理，我们常常把它归纳为儒家的一种生活方式。在如先秦的，您非常熟悉先秦的经典，像《礼记》的《儒行篇》里面，就会告诉你一个儒者是什么样子的，他有各种各样的这个多种面相，就是 many faces， 有好多张脸孔让您来看。所以我的一个理解和您的这个理解可能有一点差别，但是因为您可能主要是从社会文化现象角度给我们归纳出5个现象或者6个现象。我觉得如果我们再更立体的看儒家，我们可以把它作为一种世界观，我们可以把它作为一种价值观，我们可以把它作为一种政治制度的设计，我们还可以把它作为有一个个儒者所构成的一种这个人格的这个形象，我们还可以把它理解成为就在我们老百姓现在还活着的传统中，生活方式的传统之中。那我想这个我不知道这样理解和您理解的这个 many faces 这个本意是不是一样的？也想请教授给我们再做一个更多的解释，这个展开。另外就是特别欢迎您这个有空再到这个，就是现在我们已经放开了您再到华东师大来有Paul在这里介绍，我们到这里来，我们现场进行交流，也看看我们这个当代中国青年的学生是不是丧文化，还是说更多的是积极健康积极的一个面向。好的，我就说这一些谢谢。
Thank you very much. And
祝成老师，非常感谢你的问题。我是不是要用中文回答，还是用英语回答？
都可以。
好，那我2个都讲。
用英文吧，你用英文，我可以听，
好的。好，那okay, so I switch to English. So thank you very much for your comments, because you are really, I mean, I'm not a specialist of Confucianism. I gave just Confucianism as a sort of a case study example. I'm sure that you know much more about Confucianism. But your first comment was, me using Shinzo Mozen and the, am I not too much focusing on politics? And leaving out your Songming Li Xue and the more moral content. That's true, and probably to some extent it's true, because my field is Xianqing. And then that's basically, these texts I easily find, and they are very often, I mean, not always, very often about politics. So I'm sure that if I would, add other examples, I would indeed get into, other domains and other fields and other disciplines. And then your second comment was, you also made like a list of 6 types of Confucianism. One was Shijieguan, the other was Jiazhiguan, the other was Zhengzhizhi, and then you had Rujia de Renge, and then you had also Shenghuo de Fangshi, and 5, right? Okay, those 5. And so you asked me, is that like pretty much the same as what I'm trying to do? No, I don't think so. So what I was trying to do was giving just 6 examples of what I admit is a much wider variety, but I was trying to look at instances in which authority is a bit challenged. I do know that these 6 examples are not, the 6 types of Confucianism that exist, but just, how authority nowadays is challenged, but not terribly challenged, but a bit challenged. While what you do is, I think, you try to give, a summary, a systematic summary of 6 types of Confucianism. One of them, you said, for example, that the second one, 价值观念, so you said you have those important Confucian values, Ren, Yi, Xiaojiao, and so on and so on. And, the people more or less know what it is. And if, they have a fixed meaning, I mean, maybe I'm exaggerating a bit, but have a fixed meaning, and if not, you know, it will all be luan qi ba zhao. I think this is the typical talk of the person who claims authority and who does not want other people to redefine it in another way. But the thing is that in reality, people have defined all these values in other ways, and this is where the discussion lies. So of course they will challenge your interpretation then, or they will challenge the interpretation of the boss or the ruler or the teacher or the parents. That's how the discussion goes. I'm not saying that they are right, I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm trying to describe how the discussion often goes, and I just gave 6, I admit, not very academic, you know, examples. More, you know, as you say, 社会文化的现象. Yeah, I agree. I wanted to show, you know, how the discussion can go and how disagreement and different policies of different ways of life can be defended under the label of Confucianism. While what you try to do is, like, I think, establish what, you know, from your authority is the real Confucianism. So we are trying to do different things.
Okay.
I also, I mean, I did not express any preference for any of them. I mean, I'm not saying that Cheng is a big thinker. I'm not saying that Santiago is a great idea. I'm just showing how people try to present something different.
Yes, I see.
Confucianism. It's not an overview of all the types of Confucianism.
So, okay, can I,
Thank you.
or any more further questions? So before I open the floor to the public, we do have time, right? Is there, can I make a question too, or should I do that
Oh,
later?
no, you should, no, the chair should also feel free to be a commentator.
Okay, this was a fascinating talk. As I said, I have what I see there, I mean, I don't work in either field of yours, Carine. I work in the Middle Ages, but I work with text. So, and what I see also in the last discussion of the two of you somehow is a tension between defining or interpreting of the tradition that we have, that we refer to, and that we kind of commonly appreciate, let's put it that way, or where we share an appreciation, as you very rightly said. And I'm wondering if this is, it's kind of similar to what you proposed, of course, with the value hierarchies and the content definitions. But I'm wondering if these are different ways of doing philosophy, actually. Like if you try to define what you find in your tradition, or if you try to use what you have in your tradition as a starting point for an interpretation. And yeah, my personal interest then would be, of course, going back. Do you think something like that is visible in the history of Chinese thought also, or is that relevant at all?
Yes, I think in the history of Chinese thought, we often have the latter and not the former. So also in the preparation for the examinations, try to, you know, come up with an interpretation or a policy on the basis of an interpretation of a quote from the classics. Western philosophy, I think, I mean, this is really a very general claim, is rather doing the former.
Yeah. Okay.
In the sense that the idea is, I mean, I really put it a bit bluntly, but, you know, define your terms and then start arguing.
Yeah.
Of course, in both of the traditions, there is a lot of mixture and combination going on. So, but you begin your question by saying, are these two ways of doing philosophy? Yeah, again, this all depends what one calls philosophy. Some people don't consider anything non-Western philosophy. So, yeah. It's two ways of, let's say, the focus lies on different things, but you can easily combine them. But you can focus more on, you know, I want to make a statement about this, and therefore I temporarily define it this way, and we move on with my claims. Then you make a hierarchy of, you know, what is important, what is not important, what is more important than what else. Or you assume that something is important, and then you go into the details of what you think it is and how you should define it.
Okay.
But you can go, most people combine. They say, I have statements to make about Confucianism, and I mean by Confucianism this and this and this. And as I say, I think this is good. This makes your view more nuanced and more balanced.
Mhm.
But you also lose out on the extremes of both sides.
So it would be awareness actually that would be important of these two things to further like intercultural philosophical
Yes.
dialogue or something. Okay.
Yes,
Okay,
if
that-
you would summarize my talk in one sentence, I would say European intellectuals and journalists and scholars should realize that in China, it's not just the first discussion, it's also the second discussion. And there is a lot going on there, and you are not good at it. You don't notice it, you don't see it, and you blame the Chinese. Like, I think there are lots of Westerners who would blame people who appreciate Chinese culture, or they appreciate Confucianism as, I don't know what you say that in English, but like the heel lickers of the Chinese government.
Yeah.
It's not fair, I think. I mean, in many cases, it's fair. Sometimes maybe it is fair. I mean, for example, I just, a few weeks ago, I looked at the talk that Roger Ames gave here. I know some people would say, he is just all for China. He's all for the Chinese values. He's all for Confucianism. That's one battle he fights, pro-Confucianism. That's on the first type of this debate. The second battle he fights, and I heard it in the talk, is, yeah, but what do I mean by Xiao? What do I mean by family? And then he has to fight other people. I mean, maybe he will have to fight Professor Cheng. What he means by family is something in which men and women can do exactly the same. It's something that welcomes, if not Professor Cheng, at least Jiang Qing. Men and women can do the same. LGTB is welcome. I mean, all this is part of the family. There he has to fight Confucians who would not agree with him there. So there are like two battles, and he's not only fighting the former, he's also fighting the latter. It's unfair to say that he only fights the former.
Okay, thank you very much. And with that, I open the floor to the audience for questions. Now, oh, sorry, the 10 minutes I didn't see. Questions from the audience. I do not, Paul, do you see raised hands? I'm not sure. I don't have the whole screen here in front of me. I have part of the
No, I don't
screen.
see any, but I think we have time for maybe one question from the audience. If someone wants to, they can raise their hand or turn on their mic.
There is a question in the chat that says from Liu Yu. You want to ask that yourself, please? Or shall I read it?
Yes, Professor.
What is the yes? I should read it? Okay.
Okay, I can read it. So I'm currently studying something like the reception status of a translated Chinese version of the Chinese classics. So can I ask what information or what platforms or sources of information can I refer to? Thank you.
Sources of information of translation of the Chinese classic.
Yes, that means if I want to study how the audience in foreign countries accept or understand a certain translated Chinese classics, so where can I find the information as to how they comment on this translated version? Thank you.
Sorry, I'm afraid I cannot help you. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you know more about it than I do. Yeah, I never made any of the interpretation or the reception of Chinese classics in the different Western countries. I have no idea.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
And any other questions? I do not see any raised hands, or you can just turn on. Here's an audio turning on. Maybe we just have to wait for a second. Slow audio turning on. So in the meantime, are there any other questions, Paul? Do you see?
Professor, may I ask a question?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yes, I guess some scholars, they want to reorganize a system of concepts. It's not only just to figure out the multiple meanings of a concept, it just want to connect this together. So what do you think of this type of research? For some scholars may say, wow, Confucius himself never established or built this kind of system. This kind of scholars are just build a system on their imagination. Others think it is a good way to verify what Confucius really thinks about. Cheng.
Hello, Angela. Thank you for your question. I think it would help if I would see you, because I did not totally understand your question, but I did understand the end. So let me respond to the end. Some people say there is like the real Confucius, and others say, no, it's your imagination. I think that sort of distinction is typical for the first type of arguing. It's either real or it is imagination. And so we have to get the real thing, and only then we can start arguing. But I think, in the second type, of course, people who present Confucianism will argue that it's the real one, but you also need imagination to present it. So I don't think imagination is such a terribly bad thing. It's only when you think in terms of there is a reality somewhere, and if only I'm thinking transparently enough, and I'm objective enough, and I'm neutral enough, then I'm going to catch this reality in my words, and I will present it to the audience. If that's how you're thinking, then imagination is a big problem, because it's the absolute opposite. But I would not think in those terms, because every interpretation of every text is always, using one's own empathy, one's own context, one's own imagination, talking to one's own audience in one's own time, and making the text richer. And some is more convincing than others.
Yes, thank you for your answer, and you did get my point. But for preaching tests, it is kind of difficult to figure out what they really think about, and maybe they do not have systematic thinking. It's just comment on different things. But later Chinese philosophers did build up this kind of system. So what do you think of the differences?
Yeah, it's about the question of whether or not Chinese early preaching philosophy has a system or not. Or whether it's a formal real system.
I'm asking that for preaching tests, they may not clearly build up a system built by different concepts. But for later philosophers, we may recontribute their system.
Yes. I think whether or not somebody's thought is systematic, to some extent, belongs to the interpretation. So if you belong to a philosophy department and you look at the Leuven, it's very possible that, in order to make your interpretation convincing, you will, in one way or another, try to make that systematic. And if you belong to a philosophy department, you will maybe try to make, a system of the metaphysics of Confucius and the ethics of Confucius and the logic of Confucius. Is it in there originally? Other people will say, oh, but I have a much more convincing interpretation of Confucius. And I'm saying that whenever he meets somebody, he talks to that person to influence that person's behavior. That's another sort of non-philosophically systematic, yet also systematic interpretation, in the sense that it makes sense. And so I think every interpretation tries to make sense, of course, tries to be convincing. sees a system in it. Other people will say, oh, but you know, if you see that this is what Kongzi said when he was young, and this is when he was 30, this is when he was 40, this is when he was 50. And so you have like an evolutionist is thinking, and therefore some sayings may disagree with each other, may not look systematic, but yet there is the system of his growing. So interpretations want to be systematic in one way or another. It's not necessarily the material itself that is systematic. Of course, when you get to Songming, it's like a bit more obvious because it's explicitly presented as more systematic. So it's easier to get the system out of it. And of course, if the later you get, the more, I mean, if you read a contemporary scholar's article, you know, the sort of systematicness or systematicity you have to read into it is more given, even though there also, I think there's always an openness to interpret in a variety of ways. But I would say whether or not something is systematic, it's to a large extent the part of the interpretation, and also the type of system you want to find in it. I don't know whether this is an answer to your question.
Thank you. It is really excellent answer. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. I think we have to wrap this up. And thanks for a wonderful talk, Carine, and great and fascinating comments to Xiaojiao and Zhang. And of course to Paul and the 四海为学 for organizing this whole meeting. And I pass the word to you, Paul, for some last statements.
Yeah, no, I just want to thank everyone as well. I think it was great. So yeah, I don't know. Thank you again, everyone. Carine for presenting, Friederike for chairing, Xiaojiao and Cheng for their comments and for the audience. So yeah, thank you guys. And if you have time next month, we have another talk. So we look forward to seeing you there. Thanks.
Thanks a lot to all of you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you guys.
Bye.